I know I touched on Jessica Jones during my Secret Invasion review, but admittedly there were some parts of her backstory I left out that, well, warrant further explanations. So, let's take a look, shall we? Now, in the comics, Jessica Jones was a high school classmate of Peter Parker who was nursing a crush on the young man and worked up the courage to ask him out. Unfortunately, this was right as Peter was bitten by the radioactive spider, so yeah, it went nowhere. Sometime later, while on a vacation with her parents, the car the family was in struck a military vehicle that was carrying radioactive chemicals. Jessica was exposed to these chemicals and put into a coma, while her parents were killed. Sometime after waking up from the coma, Jessica discovered she had superpowers. She would adopt the superhero identity of Jewel. Now, unfortunately, on one of her early adventures, she came across a man named Zebediah Kilgrave, who was known as the Purple Man. He had mind control abilities and used them on Jessica in order to aid him in his crimes, and he kind of turned her into a sexual plaything. While working for the Purple Man, Jessica had an encounter with the Avengers, namely Iron Man, Scarlet Witch, and the Vision. And in the encounter, she wound up getting mercilessly beaten down. If it wasn't for the intervention of Carol Danvers, aka Miss Marvel, who had had a previous encounter with Jewel, Jessica probably would have been killed. Instead, Jessica wound up being put into a coma for several months, and when she came to, she renounced being a superhero and wound up starting her own detective agency. Now, even though she didn't really want to work much with superheroes, as a detective, Jessica wound up working a lot with superheroes, namely Luke Cage. And she and Cage would have an on-again, off-again relationship. And after one occasion, Jessica discovered that she was pregnant with Luke's baby, and, well, this was enough for them to start pursuing a more committed relationship. Now, kind of outside of comics and more into her creation, Jessica debuted in a comic titled Alias in 2001. Not that Alias. Although, admittedly, I am surprised more people haven't made that confusion. Anyway, Alias was part of Marvel's Marvel Max line, which was their attempt at doing mature-rated comics. Basically the comic book equivalent of an R-rated movie. The stories were written by Brian Michael Bendis, and the artwork was done by Michael Gaydos. Now, even though the Max line was not intended to necessarily be part of the Marvel Universe, it still kind of was also part of the Marvel Universe. And Jessica's stories in particular were meant to take place in the Marvel Universe. She had connections to the Avengers, Luke Cage, Daredevil, and the like. But there were still some restrictions put on this. Marvel refused to let Spider-Man be in the comic, for example. And because of this, Brian Michael Bendis decided to end Alias and relaunch Jessica in a more all-ages appropriate title called The Pulse. And that's what we'll be taking a look at today. The Pulse.
A nervous Jessica wakes up in bed with Luke. She's up early because she has an appointment at the Daily Bugle about a possible job, which she needs for the insureds. Jessica arrives at the Daily Bugle and is greeted by the paper's editor-in-chief, Robbie Robertson. Robbie takes her into the office of J. Jonah Jameson. Jonah begins explaining that the newspaper business is shrinking, and that has forced him to start rethinking certain things, namely his stance on superheroes. Jameson admits that he still hates superheroes with the power of a million exploding suns, but the public loves them, so he has to give the people what they want. Jonah announces the Bugle is starting a new section focused on superheroes called The Pulse. He wants Jessica to serve as an analyst who will work alongside Ben Urich, who will actually be writing the stories. Jessica states that in order for her to take the job, she needs two things: a guaranteed salary and health insurance, because she's pregnant. Jameson asks, is the baby Luke Cage's? Jessica confirms it. Jameson gives in to her demands on one condition: the Bugle gets exclusive coverage, including the birth announcement, and first photo op of the baby. Jessica reluctantly accepts. Meanwhile, a body has been discovered floating in the West End Central Park Reservoir. As the body is fished out, the forensics team determines that the body is that of a woman who was dropped into the water by someone flying overhead. The woman's ID is then found. The woman is named Terry Kidder. She's a reporter for the Daily Bugle. Kidder had been struggling professionally as of late. J. Jonah Jameson had openly ripped her in front of the news staff for writing a fluff piece on the Avengers. As she struggles to find a backup story, she received a call about a fight between Spider-Man and the Vulture. She arrived only to find that several TV news crews were already on the scene. She got squeezed out again. Dejected, Terry had lunch with an old school friend named Cheryl. During the lunch, Cheryl accidentally lets slip that several of her co-workers have been disappearing. The company she works for is Oscorp.
Now, if I need to explain that Oscorp is the corporation run by Norman Osborn, aka longtime Spider-Man villain the Green Goblin, then you obviously know nothing about comics.
Terry tried to get more information, but Cheryl clammed up. She'd said too much. Cheryl pleaded with Terry to not pursue it any further, and Terry did agree to give it up. She was lying, naturally, and immediately set up an interview with Osborn under the guise of writing another fluff piece. She arrived at Oscorp headquarters shortly thereafter and began asking Norman about the disappearing employees. Osborn chuckles and gives her credit. Not many reporters have succeeded by playing to his ego. Unfortunately, Terry now knows too much. Osborn grabs Terry by the throat and slowly begins strangling her to death. He then donned his Green Goblin gear and flew off with her body over the Central Park Reservoir, where he would drop her body off. Back at the Bugle, Jonah and Robbie inform the newsroom of Terry's murder. Jameson then issues an edict. The Bugle takes care of its own. He orders Ben Urich, Jessica Jones, and another reporter named Cat Farrell to investigate the murder. Urich tries asking the chief investigator on the case, one Detective Gates, but he doesn't get much. Meanwhile, Cat Farrell asks a source of hers that works at the coroner's office. The source informs Farrell that Kidder was already dead when she was dropped, and he does mean dropped, into the reservoir. Back at the Bugle, Urich accidentally breaks the tape on Terry's office on purpose. He then finds a message on Terry's answering machine that Gates missed. The message is from Cheryl, telling Terry once again to forget about Oscorp. The name Oscorp sends a chill down Ben's spine. He then places a call to Peter Parker and asks for information on the Green Goblin.
Now, during this time in the Daredevil comics, there was a storyline being run in which Matt Murdock's identity as Daredevil had been exposed by a local newspaper. This was a rival newspaper to the Daily Bugle, and, well, J. Jonah Jameson was more than a little peeved that the Bugle got scooped. Now, Ben Urich actually spoke on behalf of Matt Murdock, saying that Matt Murdock was not Daredevil. As you may remember from my Born Again review, Urich had actually pieced together the truth that Murdock was Daredevil long ago, but he was obviously just trying to cover up for his friend. Someone else came to Urich's aid, namely Peter Parker.
Urich meets with Spider-Man on the roof of the Daily Bugle. When questioned how he deduced Spidey's identity, Urich points out two things. First, Peter Parker is the only person in the world to get decent pictures of Spider-Man. Second, Parker knew that Matt Murdock was Daredevil. Changing back to the initial subject, Urich asks, is Norman the Green Goblin? Peter says yes. Urich snaps. He had written a book exposing Osborn as the Goblin, only to have it be pulled when Osborn threatened to sue. Peter points out that Osborn killed Gwen Stacy, the first woman he ever loved. This is enough to calm Ben down. Ben goes to talk with Cheryl about Terry. After informing her of Terry's murder, Ben asks what it was the two were talking about exactly. Urich then takes the information to Jameson. He'll write the story, but only if the Bugle will actually publish it. Jessica then chimes in with the fact that knowing one of the city's most prominent men is a killer, and sitting on it, is probably not in the public's best interest. Jonah gives the okay, and Urich prepares to call the police with his findings. Jameson tells Jessica to accompany Ben to the police. She's the only person there not personally involved in the story. Ben, Jessica, and several NYPD officers arrive at Oscorp. As they make their way to Norman's office, smoke begins to emanate from behind the door. Ben and Jessica take cover, but it's too late for the police. The Goblin has set off an armament of his pumpkin bombs. Ben and Jessica emerge from the wreckage just as Norman takes off on the Goblin glider. Ben and Jessica split off as the Goblin fires off more pumpkin bombs. One lands near Jessica and she's thrown from the building. It's then that Spider-Man arrives and catches Jessica. The two land on a roof and Jessica begins to flip out over concerns for the baby. Back at Oscorp, the Goblin is able to locate Ben and begins choking him, much like he did Terry. Thankfully, Spidey arrives to save Ben. The Goblin then tries to leave Oscorp, only for Jessica to jump him, fearing for the baby she may have just lost. Jessica takes the Goblin down and begins beating him. That is until Norman is able to call the glider and hit Jessica from behind. This allows Norman to escape, much to Jessica's chagrin. Jessica is taken to NYU Medical Center and checked out. It turns out the baby is fine, possibly due to having superpowered parents. Meanwhile, now having hard evidence with the deaths of the police officers, the Bugle is now allowed to run a headline about Osborn being the Goblin. Osborn plans to fight the paper's assertion and hires one of the Kingpin's old attorneys to defend him. As Osborn's limo is pulling away from the police headquarters, the car runs smack dab into Luke Cage. Obviously wanting payback for what happened to Jessica and the baby, Cage calls Osborn out. This is just when Spider-Man arrives to try to talk Luke down, and this is enough to bring Osborn out. He emerges from the car wearing the Goblin mask and riding the glider. Luke and Spidey work together to stop Osborn, this time in front of most of the general public and the press. Osborn is taken in, big shock, and the Bugle newsroom rejoices. Jessica, though, is just happy her baby is alright.
Well, that ends the first part of the Pulse, but we're still not quite done yet.
There is a massive explosion at Jessica and Luke's apartment, and fearing for the safety of her baby, Jessica is rushed into the hospital emergency room.
Wait a minute. Jessica being caught in an explosion and worrying about the safety of her baby happened in the last story. It was the climax of the story. We're seriously repeating that?
Actually, there is a difference this time. Luke was in the blast as well. And upon hearing that their unborn child is okay, Jessica is then informed about a complication with Luke. He might be suffering from some form of organ damage, but they can't operate on him due to his unbreakable skin. It prevents the surgeons from cutting in.
You know, this is actually like the fourth time I've covered a story that prominently features Luke Cage, but I've never really given a backstory for the character. Let's rectify that, shall we? Carl Lucas was born and raised in Harlem, New York. A former gang member who was framed for heroin possession by his best friend, Lucas wound up being sentenced to a prison in Georgia. In prison, he volunteered for a Captain America-esque super soldier program. However, a racist security guard wound up tampering with some of the chemicals, and a large amount of them wound up being injected into Cage's bloodstream. Instead of killing him, though, this wound up giving him superhuman strength and unbreakable skin. Lucas eventually escaped from prison and made his way back to New York, where he rechristened himself Luke Cage and started a business known as Hero for Hire. He would do heroing work for the right price. Over time, though, Cage would eventually change his ways and become more of an urban freedom fighter. In fact, not too long after this, he wound up becoming a member of the Avengers.
The police arrive to interrogate Jessica. She tells them that when she and Luke are returning home, a strange woman suddenly appeared in their apartment. The woman asked Cage if he thought he'd really get away with it, and then exploded. That's all she remembers. Later, Jessica sits at Luke's bedside along with Luke's best friend and business partner, Danny Rand, aka Iron Fist. It's then that Nick Fury arrives. Danny fills Fury in on the situation as Jessica asks if Nick knows who is really behind this attack. Fury only responds with silence. Captain America arrives and begins yelling at Fury. Cap says things like, "I knew something like this would happen. You knew this would happen." Captain throws Fury out of the room and tells Danny to get Luke out of the hospital. Jessica, being left out of the loop, gets up to call her lawyer. While on the phone, she notices a suspicious-looking man in the waiting room. As Jessica begins calling Ben Urich, the man gets up and begins exiting the hospital. Suddenly, there's another explosion. Jessica rushes to Luke's room, only to find it empty. Even Danny's gone. The next day, Ben arrives at Luke and Jessica's apartment where Jessica has spent the night. Jessica explains everything up until Luke's disappearance, including the sudden appearances of Fury and Cap. Urich is surprised. No one at the Bugle knew anything of the attacks. The two go back to the hospital and begin asking questions, but to no avail. Ben then calls the Daily Bugle and someone tells him about another explosion at a nearby pier. At the pier, Jessica asks a local transient about what happened. The man says that several heroes, including Cap, Daredevil, and Spider-Man, were involved in some sort of fight. As her last hope, Jessica calls her ex-boyfriend, S.H.I.E.L.D. agent Clay Quartermain, only to find his number disconnected. She tries other people: Danny Rand, Misty Knight, Matt Murdock, other friends of Luke Cage. Still nothing. Finally, Ben and Jessica go to the Bugle to ask J. Jonah Jameson for help, but he's hamstrung too. Fury has a special government clearance that prevents any, and I mean any, news outlet from reporting on his activities. This causes Jessica to storm out of the Bugle, where she sees another suspicious-looking individual, only for him to teleport away before she can get to him. As a last-ditch effort, Jessica visits Luke's friend Misty Knight, but Misty's not home. Jessica then passes out on the sidewalk. Her unconscious body is then picked up by two agents, but not agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., agents of Hydra.
Unless you've been living under a rock the last few years, you probably know that Hydra is arguably the most prominent terrorist group in the Marvel Universe.
Jessica comes to in an airplane hangar and is greeted by a Hydra agent. The woman, who is an empath, tries to calm Jessica down, but Jessica just wants to know what is going on. The Hydra woman tells Jessica that they don't know where Luke is, but they are working on locating him. She tells Jessica that Luke is proof of Fury's secret war, and Fury, but not S.H.I.E.L.D., is behind Luke's disappearance. Meanwhile, Ben Urich gets a call from a man named Al McKenzie. Al is a former S.H.I.E.L.D. agent who Ben had interacted with in the past. McKenzie tells Urich that Fury did something so bad, there's nothing he could do to unmake it. McKenzie gives Urich the go-ahead to actually print the story. Urich takes the information to Jameson. Ben points out this has to be big because S.H.I.E.L.D. agents are notoriously loyal to Fury. They wouldn't just sell him out like this.
What they're talking about was a Marvel Comics miniseries called Secret War, not to be confused with Secret Wars, in which Nick Fury led a superhero team consisting of Captain America, Wolverine, Luke Cage, Spider-Man, and a few others on a military-esque mission into Latveria to break up a terrorist cell. Thing is, Fury did not have permission from either the United Nations or the U.S. government to do this, and in order to cover up some of his actions, Fury wound up having the heroes mind wiped at the end of the story.
Back with Jessica, the Hydra agent makes an offer. Join Hydra, and they will make sure that both Jessica and the baby are taken care of. All it takes is enough information to bring down S.H.I.E.L.D. They offer Jessica money, but she throws it back in their face. It's then that a group of S.H.I.E.L.D. agents burst into the hangar and take down Hydra. Agent Quartermain, Jessica's ex, explains the situation to her. They had traced her cell phone, but needed to wait until she turned Hydra down to move. Unfortunately, they have no idea where Luke is either. The next day at the Bugle, Jessica rips into Jameson for not helping her and storms out of the office once more. Both Ben and Cap Farrell pursue Jessica, and it's then that Ben recognizes Agent McKenzie standing across the street from the Bugle. Agent McKenzie talks to the trio and tells them where Luke is likely being kept. Ben, Jessica, and Kat arrive at a roadhouse in upstate New York. Ben doesn't believe Luke is really being kept here. He's right, as upon entering the bar, they find a drunk and depressed Wolverine instead. He doesn't know anything about Luke. However, mentioning Fury causes him to almost attack Jessica. Thankfully, he comes to his senses. Logan points out that they're sent there as part of a power play. Anger Logan enough so that he would go after and kill Fury. Logan then leaves the three, pointing out that Cage couldn't be too hard to find. After all, where could a sick/injured superhero really go? This causes Ben to suddenly realize where Luke is. The trio return to New York City, where Ben takes them to a special superhero clinic known as the Night Medical Center. Jessica makes her way into the clinic, only to be halted right at the door by Danny Rand, Misty Knight, and several others. Jessica pleads with Danny to let her see Luke, but he can't. Danny explains that he can't trust Jessica. He's not even sure the baby she's carrying is really Luke's.
Okay, I'm sure that Danny was more about trying to keep Luke away from Fury and S.H.I.E.L.D., and he wasn't entirely sure that Jessica wasn't being followed. But that being said, that whole baby thing was a little cold and heartless and really mean-spirited, uncalled for.
Possibly realizing how stupid he was, Danny relents and lets Jessica see Luke. Luke is conscious and stable. Jessica lies and says that Danny took care of her the whole time. It's then that Nick Fury arrives via hologram. Nick apologizes for what he put Luke and Jessica through, though Jessica is having none of it. Fury then leaves. Lastly, back at the Bugle, J. Jonah Jameson chickens out and decides not to print any of Ben Urich's story about Fury and the Secret War.
We're still not done yet. We still have one last story to go in The Pulse.
Jessica Jones arrives at the Baxter Building, home of the Fantastic Four. After interacting with the Richards children, Jessica and Sue Richards go out to a lunch date with Carol Danvers, aka Miss Marvel.
Now this actually makes sense. Jessica is actually trying to get advice from two of the female Marvel superheroes who have actually been pregnant. Sue with Franklin and Valeria, and Carol with, that whole storyline is so twisted and disturbing that I'm just not even going to touch it with a 40-foot pole. Just Google Ms. Marvel pregnancy. You'll get your answer.
Jessica picks Sue's brain about being a superheroic mom and the likelihood that her child will be a mutant. Sue breaks it down for Jessica. Once the baby arrives, everything that Jessica thought about herself will now be focused on her child's well-being, which, in turn, will lead to a whole new level of stress. Jessica wonders, is Sue ever worried about the fact that her kids have powers? Sue says no, she just has everything else in the world to worry about. Sue then tells Jessica to just try her best and it should all work out. After lunch, Carol and Jessica join Luke at the fashion design offices of Janet Van Dyne, aka the Wasp. Jan has been working on some new superhero outfits for Luke now that he's officially joined the Avengers. Carol and Jessica laugh about the outfits when Jessica's water breaks. Carol flies Jessica off to the hospital while Luke tries to call a cab. Jan, meanwhile, calls the Avengers. At the hospital, Jessica tells the attending physician that she's only 6 months along. Unbeknownst to everyone, one of the nurses has begun calling the press. Meanwhile, Ben Urich has been investigating the foiling of a jewelry store robbery by Daredevil. But there's some problems. 1. Daredevil was in his original yellow costume. 2. He stunk. He smelled like the sewers. And 3. He apparently stole some of the jewels. Cap Farrell points out that this might actually be the former Avenger named D-Man.
D-Man, or Demolition Man, was Dennis Dunphy, a former professional wrestler who got superpowers after a series of medical experiments paid for by a corrupt sports agent. Now, he does wear a costume similar to Daredevil's original costume, but he does this out of tribute to Daredevil, who's his favorite hero. He was also an Avenger after helping out Captain America on several occasions, though eventually D-Man would leave the team in order to use his superpowers to help the homeless, even setting up a commune for them in the New York City sewers.
Back at the hospital, Jessica is informed that she's being kicked out due to the facility not being equipped to handle a superhero birth. Also, the hospital director's a bigot. Thankfully, the other Avengers arrive to transfer Jessica to the Quinjet, just as Luke arrives. Luke manages to leap onto the craft just as it takes off, and the Avengers go to the one person best equipped for this type of situation. Doctor Strange?
Wait a minute. Stephen Strange was a surgeon, not an OBGYN. I mean, okay, he probably delivered a few babies in his time, but that hardly makes him an expert, especially over someone whose primary medical training is delivering babies.
Back with Ben Urich, he manages to track down D-Man. Unfortunately, it appears the former Avenger is in poor mental health. D-Man explains that someone or something called the Cosmic Games Master told him that D-Man needed to capture the Infinity Gems in order to save the Earth. Dunphy believes the jewels he stole are the gems. Ben takes pity on D-Man and later returns with Daredevil. Daredevil convinces Dunphy to get some help. Back at the Sanctum Sanctorum, the press begins to gather outside. Cap Farrell approaches Captain America to point out the Bugle has exclusive rights to the first pictures. Cap says he'll let cat in once everything is calmed down. Inside, Jessica calls Jameson on the phone and begins cursing him out. A few hours later, Luke Cage comes out of the delivery room and announces, "It's a girl." As Jessica and Luke marvel over their baby, Luke proposes marriage. Suffice to say, Jessica is shocked. She asks Cage why. Luke points out that their daughter already has a lot against her, being the biracial child of two superheroes. Why throw illegitimacy in on top of that? He also points out that he loves her and has always loved her for a long time. Jessica says she needs some time to think. A week goes by and Jessica is up late taking care of the baby. To pass the time by, Jessica begins telling the story about how she first met Luke. She starts by saying that she once tried to be a superhero again. She had adopted the name Nitrous because she thought it sounded grim and gritty. She had just tracked the mob boss known as the Owl down to a warehouse where he was making a drug deal with the Russian mafia. Not too long after she showed up, Luke Cage and Iron Fist showed up on the scene as well. During the ensuing fight, the Owl managed to cut Nitrous with a knife. She tussled with the Owl for some more time until Luke took out the monster. Luke and Danny convinced Jessica to stay and fill out a report with the police. Not too long after they arrive, they discover two kids sitting in the back seat of the Russian's car. This is enough for Jessica to renounce being a superhero once more, as she unmasks and offers to watch the kids for the night until Child Protective Services can pick them up the next morning. Later that night, Luke visited Jessica to check on her and the kids. He cleans and dresses her wound, and then stayed up with her the most of the night. The next day, he made breakfast for her and the kids as Child Services came to pick them up. Returning to the present, Jessica makes her decision. The next day, an angry Jessica chews out Luke after having to walk up 300 floors to the Avengers' apartments. Immediately, the women in the room, save for Jessica Drew, begin fawning over the newborn baby. As Jessica calms down, she turns to Luke and says yes.
Well, since I cover professional wrestling, I kind of have to do this, don't I? Yes! Yes! Yes!
Everybody begins to celebrate, but the celebration is short-lived as the mayor of New York City arrives to receive a tour of Avengers Tower. However, before the tour can start, an attack begins. The Avengers spring into action only to discover that they're fighting a new incarnation of the Super Adaptoid.
The Super Adaptoid was an android created to absorb and mimic the powers of multiple superheroes at once. Originally developed by AIM, this incarnation of the Adaptoid is actually developed by Hydra.
The Adaptoid absorbs the abilities of all the Avengers except for Iron Man and begins increasing its attack. Eventually, Spider-Man takes the Adaptoid down long enough for Iron Man to begin blasting it with all of his armor iterations. Finally subdued, the Adaptoid is revealed to be Yelena Belova, another Black Widow who the team had encountered earlier. Before she can reveal anything, Hydra cuts the telepathic links she had with the Adaptoid, and it blows up. The battle finally over, Luke and Jessica are married by Stan Lee. Wait a minute.
Okay, wait a minute here. Stan Lee is Jewish, so he can't be a reverend or a priest. And he can't be a rabbi because neither Luke or Jessica is Jewish, and thus he wouldn't be able to perform the ceremony if he were a rabbi. And I don't know about you, but I don't think Justice of the Peace wear garb like that. How is this marriage legal? Well, okay, nitpicking aside, that does kind of conclude The Pulse. How was it? It was actually pretty good. The first part of the story is definitely the strongest. It's very tight, great artwork, good writing, really decently set up storyline. The second story and third story both come across a little padded, and while the artwork is good, switching from Mark Bagley to Brett Anderson to Michael Lark to Michael Gaydos to Olivier Coipel is a little jarring at times. And as I said, this does wind up kind of concluding the series. The series suffered a lot from shipping issues, primarily because there were a few tie-in storylines that it was caught up with. House of M being one. That issue was not included in this trade. and the Secret War storyline, which was so massively delayed. It took almost 3 years for 4 issues of a comic to come out. But overall, I would have to give The Pulse a B. It was a thoroughly enjoyable read. And with that, let's see what we'll be doing next time on the Random Trade Review.